Thank you very much, Mr Chair. No, that's perfectly sufficient. Mr Chair, I wanted to take this call soon after the Minister resumed his seat, because at the beginning of Rodney Hyde's speech, he talked about the things that are shared in this House. And I talked about that in an earlier contribution in this debate. We all share the horrendous stories of victims. And we have worked with, many of us have worked with victims. Even in my short time as an MP, I've done that, the victims of crime. And we also share concerns about reoffending. And I can share that with Rodney Hyde. But when I hear the Minister stand up and say, criticise this side of the House as people who've spent a lifetime defending criminals, it's very difficult to have respect for the Minister and respect for this piece of legislation when she puts out statements like that. Mr Hyde didn't do that, and I give him credit for that at the beginning of his statement. He talked about what's shared across this House. But the Minister's comment was disgraceful, and she should be ashamed to sit there and make that kind of comment. And her smug performance this evening does nothing for the victims of crime. Her performance this evening and the performance of the National Party this evening has done nothing to reassure New Zealanders that this bill is actually about their public safety and is not about political slogans. We've heard nothing from members of the National Party of substance, and I will credit Mr Garrett in this debate. He has provided substantive contributions for why he believes in this bill. We have not heard that from the National Party, and I believe, Mr Chair, that part of that reason is that the National Party and members of the National Party do not support this bill. I know that members of the National Party do not support this bill, and many of them do not support it because they know that advice from people like the Ministry of Justice, who are the main policy advisors on these matters, goes against this bill. And Mrs Collins got up before and attempted to try and obfuscate about this and say, oh, it wasn't corrections, it wasn't police. The comments that have been read out in this House were from the government's chief advisors on justice issues, and they said the proposed policy changes are unlikely to be consistent with the government's publicly announced policy in relation to the drivers of crime, and the Ministry of Justice view is that the deterrence effect of the three-stage regime is uncertain. The proposals will add costs without creating any significantly improved outcomes in terms of reducing the drivers of crime, improving social outcomes, or reducing reoffending and victimisation. In other words, the Ministry of Justice is saying the bill will not work. And in part two, we're looking at the parole aspects of this. And we've heard a number of times from the Minister that parole is in fact not a right, it's a privilege. That's what the Parole Act says today. Nothing's changing. Nothing's changing. That's what the Parole Act says today. And the Minister has made comments about where Labor was on this. Labor toughened parole rules. Labor toughened parole laws. The Minister doesn't want to acknowledge that because it suits the Minister's political sloganeering to say that we weren't tough around parole. But we were, and parole is not a right. It is a privilege. That doesn't change. If we want to improve the way parole operates, let's strengthen the parole board. Let's look at the mandate of the parole board. But this change and these changes are not about changing suddenly parole from being a privilege to a right. That is pure and simple spin. But, Mr Chair, my main concern about parole and the taking away of parole here is about the safety of our prison officers and the safety in prisons and the safety of our police. Because without the hope of parole, we risk further attacks on prison officers, we risk further attacks on police. And I have spoken to a number of people who visited in prisons. I myself have spent time visiting in prisons as well, and there's one thing that prisoners need in order to be able to behave well, and that's hope. They've got to have some hope. Prisoners have very little else, but if they don't have hope, their behaviour will deteriorate, and we will see more attacks in our prisons. And if we really are serious about this, we need to look at the drivers of crime. We need to make sure that people are not getting in this position. But rather than that, what we have seen from this government is simple sloganeering, cheap shots from the Minister tonight, rather than actually, they were cheap shots, Minister. Is it not a cheap shot to say the Labor Party has spent a lifetime defending criminals? That's what the Minister said. That's a cheap shot. We deserve better in this House than laws that are coming forward as sloganeering, Labor has got a proud record of addressing the causes of crime and strengthening laws on crime, Mrs Gowdy, but what this bill is about is simple sloganeering. It's not going to work. The Parole Board deserves to be strengthened. This law didn't work.
The Honourable Judith
Mr Chair,
Collins.
I've got a few things to say to that member.